Okay, Senate Appropriations, page 22nd. We have a few bills that have been sent to us by our favorite rule, Rule 31. And first we're going to take up 397, the flood response bill, or other people call it the hazard bill. It seems to have different names. It's a bill by many names. And this is Collmore, but Collmore said, go ahead without him. We can go get him next door if we need him, but he's starting his committee. But I wondered if, Chris, you want to lead us through the fiscal note? Sure. And then Tucker's here if we have questions on the underlying bill.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chris Swoop, Joint Fiscal, and Mr. Chair, I think Tucker will also walk you through a suggested amendment to clarify a few things on this bill as well.
That's right.
So, if the committees
about that.
would like me to screen share, do that. There's a fiscal note posted. This is H397, a bill that Tucker and I have spent an inordinate amount of time testifying on in different committees. There's only a few things in here that really pertain to money at this point, related to the state. And the biggest ones are that there are provisions in this bill that would shift the allocation of local option tax revenue from the current 70-30 split between the towns who levy local option taxes, keeping 70% and 30% going to the pilot special fund. This bill would change that allocation to 75-25. So the towns who levy local option taxes would be able to keep an additional 5% of the revenue from under current law. Those of you who are on the Transportation Committee, I just want to flag that the local option tax on jet fuel is not impacted by this.
Is there a local option on jet?
There is in South Burlington, but the 30% doesn't go to the pilot fund, it goes to the T fund. And that's to be used for aviation-related purposes. So since that's sort of a different issue, that is not addressed in this bill, and it's a very sort of peripheral issue.
It's not limited to aviation. It just goes to the general T fund.
It has to be used for aviation purposes. So the cut that South Burlington gets, the 70% they get, they use for aviation-related purposes, and the money that goes into the T fund, just like the taxes on avgas, they get reinvested in the aviation program, and some of that does come back to the Burlington Airport every year. We expect that change. It would be effective October 1st of this year at the request of the tax department. A full annualized impact of that change would be about a $2.8 million shift of revenue from the pilot fund to the towns with local option taxes. I will get to this on the second page, but the pilot fund has a surplus in it. It has been running a structural surplus. Pilot payments to towns are fully funded. They were first fully funded in FY24. They continue to be fully funded in 25 and 26. We think that going from 70 to 75 will still have enough cash coming into the pilot fund every year to have a positive revenue situation, so that we will continue to be able to fully fund the pilot payments and not create a structural deficit. If you were to go further to 80-20, you would create a structural deficit in the pilot fund moving forward, and there wouldn't be enough money coming in to fully fund pilot payments without either reducing them or cutting into the surplus in the pilot fund. The other piece that's in this bill is kind of boring unless you represent Washington County or the town of Milton, and relates to some overpayments of education property taxes related to the Barry and Milton TIF districts. And this is sort of a technical cleanup piece that Tucker will walk you through an amendment on, but these two towns are owed a combination of $621,000. This was flagged in some audits for their TIF programs for education taxes that they had overpaid in prior years. This expense was not calculated, it was not factored into the yield calculations. So what is proposed here is that there's a neutral transaction where that exact amount of money would be transferred from the general fund into the ed fund. And then the ed fund would give that money to the tax department to cut checks to those towns. since it's related to education property tax overpayments.
Do we know how the mistake was made?
There was some administrative and software errors involved.
The town's part or the state's part?
I believe they were related to how the town was administering the programs and the software vendor that was in place at the time, but it was caught in some regular audits of the TIF programs. And there's one other related piece to TIF that would be of interest to the Washington County folks, and that's a 2-year extension on Barry's deck incursion period. So I've already covered most of the substance here. Tucker will show you in the language. There's one change to the Community Resilience and Disaster Mitigation Grant Program that you all created in S310 last year, just to make voluntary buyouts of flood impacted and flood prone properties a permissible use of that grant program. Doesn't put any more money into it, it just changes the allowable.
Is there any money in that fund that does those grants?
There was some money put in the budget last year through the, I believe through the contingent appropriation process. I don't know off the top of my head what is in there right now. There are 3 other sections related to municipal indebtedness that don't, and municipal finance that don't have a direct impact to the state, but since they're revenue and fiscal in nature, we pointed them out. One was language that would allow towns to have some greater flexibility with maintaining an unassigned fund balance at year-end close, and Tucker can walk you through some of those nuances, but having a unassigned fund balance is generally viewed as a credit positive and a good fiscal practice to help towns have the ability to respond to emergencies and unforeseen events. Another section in here relates to emergency borrowing authority. It would give towns on a limited basis in an emergency situation the ability to borrow for up to 5 years without having to seek voter approval first. Right now, under current law, they can only do that for 1 year. So that gives towns a little more flexibility in responding to disaster situations. Another section in here relates to level debt service. So in the way we as a state do our general obligation bonds and the way many towns structure their debt is on level principal payments, which means you pay higher amounts of debt service in the initial years, and that amount goes down over the course of the amortization period. That tends to accelerate the amortization and the pay down of the principal. However, it creates a pretty sizable budgetary impact in the first few years. This language, which I believe was suggested by the League of Cities and Towns, would give towns the option to have level debt service instead. And that works more like your mortgage at home, where you're paying the same amount every year over the life of the debt. It would be more affordable to a town in the initial years. The trade-off, of course, is that over the life of a bond issue, you pay a little bit more in interest. But this would just give towns that flexibility. The piece about the local option tax revenue share that I had mentioned, here are some numbers around that. You'll see that under current law, these estimates in the table reflect all of the towns that we know of that have approved local option taxes in 2025. And we would expect just under $60 million of total local option tax revenue to come in. You would see under the current law where the 70% goes to the towns, we'd have about 17 million coming into the pilot fund. Under the proposed change to go to 75-25, you would see that go down to 14.65 million in the pilot fund. And then on an annualized basis moving forward, it represents roughly a $2.8 million change. I would just remind the committee that you all in the budget appropriated around $14 million from the pilot fund. So that was just under 12.4 for the general pilot payments and the corrections pilot. You also did a $1 million appropriation for the municipal grand list stabilization program. That will get that program through about the first 2 years or so. Then future appropriations will likely be needed in the out years. You also appropriated $1.15 million for the town highway non-federal disasters. So when you factor all these things together, if you go back to that table, $14.6 million still coming into the pilot fund every year should be adequate to cover what we expect the recurring costs to be in future years. So you're not creating any sort of structural imbalance between revenues and expenditures in the out years. And then I just put a little piece in here about those refunds of overpayments. You'll see that the city of Barry is owed around $437,000 for overpayments of education property taxes in prior fiscal years. They gave more to the ed fund than they should have and retained less in their TIF program than they should have. Similar situation in Milton, the amount is $184,000 and change. And Tucker will show you in the language how this would sort of, we have a suggestion for the committee to offer an amendment to just make some technical changes to make this language a little easier to execute on the accounting side. So
I do have a question, Chris, in reference to the $14.65 million.
Yeah.
Is that pretty much static, or does that fluctuate historically?
You know, that's a great question. My colleague Ted did an issue brief on the issue of pilot and local option taxes. It's on our website if you want to read through at your leisure. But we've seen revenues from local option taxes increase quite a bit in recent years. And so that 14.65 is fairly strong historically. What has been driving that is we've had a lot more towns adopt local option taxes in recent years. You all passed a change to the law last year that allows towns to do local option taxes without the legislature sort of blessing the charter approval, the charter amendment process. And we've also seen, as a result of the Wayfair decision, consumer behavior changing after COVID, we've seen consumption tax revenue in general really be strengthened since the pandemic. So the big known unknown right now is these taxes tend to be very sensitive to what's going on in the economy, travel and tourism behavior, things like that. Obviously, we're in an era where there's some uncertainty that hasn't really shown up in the data yet due to timing lags. So it is entirely possible that the consensus revenue forecast in a few months could show some softening in expectations moving forward, but I don't think you would see that 14.65 really crater out unless something really significant happens to the economy and to tourism to our state.
Thank you.
I had a question on the for the unassigned fund balance. Why did we not allow them to? What did they have to do now if this bill didn't pass?
You know, that is a wonderful segue for Ledge Council.
Okay.
If there's any other questions on the fiscal note.
That's called the root, by the way.
Is it? I'm glad it has a technical term. And I'm glad it came up so late in the session.
Thank you, Mr. Root.
Very Matrix-esque of you introducing me there. For the record, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. You have in front of you H397 as reported by Senate Government Operations, and you should also have an amendment from Senate Finance that adds one section to the bill. I likely will not get into very granular detail on anything besides the TIF district language, but I will cover some of the questions that have come up on the other sections and quickly run through the words on the page in those sections so that you know what is in the bill. There is quite a bit in here. As you noted, it's known by a couple different names, but broadly you can think of this as an omnibus bill covering all hazards, response, resiliency, and mitigation. And all hazards, you know, the bill focuses on floods, but it covers everything from radiological events, weather events, chemical spills, anything that could be deemed a statewide or local emergency by the governor.
Is this the bill that originally had the fire apparatus?
This did indeed have the fire apparatus, and I am so pleased that that term persisted because I feel like it's my one meaningful contribution to the budget process this year is that I identified that the legal term for a fire truck is a fire apparatus. So,
Thank you.
yes, great. So I'm in section 3 just to flag, Chris already brought this up. But in section 3 of the bill, within the community resiliency and mitigation fund that's operated by the Division of Emergency Management, as part of the program, you've added a discretionary use of the program grant funds for voluntary buyouts for flood impacted or prone properties. Voluntary buyout programs already operate within the state. They're fairly reliant on the availability of FEMA funds for these buyouts. And you asked the question of whether or not this fund currently has any money in it. And my understanding from a lot of testimony in Senate Government Operations is that it's a dwindling amount, perhaps nothing at all at this point. But moving forward, if funds were appropriated for this program, the Division of Emergency Management would have discretionary authority to continue operating voluntary buyouts. And you put a lot of structures around this in the budget, including what Chris brought up with the Municipal Grand List Stabilization Program, which reimburses municipalities for grand list loss when there's a voluntary buyout.
Senator Watson.
In that language about the flood prone properties. So this is a program that has existed for some time. And so presumably there's no issues with the definitions of, I realize this is somewhat outside of the scope of the money aspect of this, but just thinking about how we define flood prone for a flood prone property, but they must have some working definition because they're doing it.
Yes, and originally this language was just for flood impacted properties, but the division flagged that the program they're operating right now, which is not in statute at all, that they also allow buyouts for properties that are identified as flood prone or vulnerable. And vulnerable didn't show up anywhere in the gray literature around this, so prone was the term that was chosen here.
Senator Norris.
Yeah, Tucker, on the voluntary buyouts for flood impacted or prone properties, is there a cap on that, or is this fair market value?
It's
or
fair market value.
Fair market?
Yes.
But doesn't that go down if you can't build?
So originally the bill had a slightly different structure for the buyout program. It was a little more limited. It was only for flood impacted properties, and it focused on the full fair market value at the time that the flood event happened.
Okay.
So you're not looking at the diminished value of the property. You're looking at the property owner voluntarily working with municipality, effectively selling their property for what it was worth at the time that it was impacted by the flood. And there was a requirement in that language, which also exists in all of the FEMA funding, that that property not be developed ever again.
That's why I was wondering about the value of the property.
It has to be torn down, the structure has to be torn down.
Yes, and that is also tied into the Municipal Grand List Stabilization Program, because that is where the grand list loss happens, when it's turned into open space and is no longer residential property. If we are okay, I'll move into the 3 sections that relate to municipal finances. The unassigned fund balance. This allows municipalities to carry forward unexpended funds, which is something that they're not permitted to do now because the budgetary process at the local level, unless it's modified by charter, requires that the budget at the municipal level be approved by the voters. So the way that that's expressed is in a specific dollar amount, and most municipalities dedicate each line item in the budget to a vote for a specific project. And if they save money through that process and they have unexpended funds, they have 2 options. They can continue to dedicate that money to the purpose that the voters approved, or they have to go back to the voters to approve moving that money to some other function. This would allow municipalities.
They could move it to just a fund.
That is the proposal here.
Well, could they do that? They could do that now. They could vote to move it to a fund.
They could vote to move it to a fund. They would do that at their annual meeting or at a special meeting called for that purpose where the voters approve moving this.
I think we've done that at my annual meeting where we just say, if there's money left over, we're going to put it in this fund.
Yes.
And I think the school boards often have that on the school vote too. You authorize the budget and you also authorize them to hold them on that.
Now, there was nothing in statute authorizing a legislative body to move money into an unassigned fund balance. There's also nothing prohibiting it. It was just a function of the current practices and the effective voter bonding between what they are approving in the budget and what the money is supposed to be expended for. So to navigate that, this section 6 allows the use of unassigned fund balances at the municipal level. And I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, okay.
Section 7 allows for emergency borrowing. If the committee is familiar with the, process of municipal debt, again, it's approved by the voters. There only is one exception, which is that for 1-year notes, the legislative body can approve the indebtedness without going to a townwide vote. This would allow in emergency situations for the legislative body to approve indebtedness for a 5-year period in response to an emergency. Chris covered it. Section 8 deals with the level debt servicing, allowing for equal payments when a municipality issues a bond.
Okay.
You heard about the local option taxes, the change in the revenue split in 24 ESA 138. That's in section 11. For those who represent Burlington, Montpelier, Williston, or Middlebury, those communities had the 70-30 split in their charter. So we cleaned that up as well so that those 4 municipalities could take advantage of what every other municipality in the state is going to get. All right.
Did you skip over the governor's power?
Yes, that was the dam provision. If
It's
you want,
only, it's only about the drawdown, or is it also?
it's only about the drawdown, and it's a very interesting structure, but the emergency authority that is granted under section 9 is to waive applicable permits
Right.
that would otherwise have to be acquired before the drawdown could be executed by the dam owner.
Because the governor already has the ability to waive permits, other permits in an emergency, but that language didn't allow this permit.
Correct, and there's some nuance here with the types of dams that we're talking about, but also that these drawdowns would have to happen in advance of an all-hazard event.
But there has to be an emergency declared?
There has to be the expectation that there is going to be damage to persons or property, substantial damage. And once that determination has been made by the director of the Division of Emergency Management, the governor, in consultation with the Secretary of Natural Resources, has authority to waive applicable permits for dam owners, and here's the last caveat, that have a plan for the drawdown that has been previously approved by the Secretary.
So, belt and suspenders.
Yes.
Well,
You wanna go?
Well, I'm getting the bill up, but how did they land with federal dams?
Federal dams are not included, and there's a few sentences that have been added to section 9 to make it clear that the federal dams stand alone.
Okay.
Those FERC regulated dams will continue to be FERC regulated.
Okay, right, and that the authority to waive those permits is not.
It's not included here, and to the extent that it would even apply, this also incorporates if there's any FERC-approved plans for drawdowns, that satisfies the planning requirement that's built into section 9.
and the FERC dams are the Connecticut dams, or the other FERC regulated dams that are not?
They are the power generating dams that have been governed by the
All the
Federal
power
Energy
dams.
Regulatory Commission.
And it's a lot of them municipals. This came out
So
of,
all the power generating dams are FERC regulated.
My understanding is that in Vermont,
this came out of just before the last flood, Morrisville Water and Lake drew the Green River Reservoir down in anticipation of the flood coming, and they started 5 days before the weather event, and they were after that they had correspondence with the Agency of Natural Resources, and they felt very uncomfortable about the situation they were in because they were told they broke the law.
But this doesn't change their situation, because they're federally regulated.
No, this would this would allow the governor to declare.
If they had a pre-approved plan.
I thought you were saying the FERC regular ones are separate.
They're separate. Yes,
So I think that wouldn't Morrisville be a FERC regulated dam? That's my understanding.
they're power generating.
Yep,
So they may already have a drop down plan.
but the concept is,
Maybe this just clarifies that they're not.
To the extent that there's
So this would be like the,
required permits at the state level for that
Yep.
dam, it could be waived.
did they talk about what dams are gonna,
There is a presentation from the dam, is it the dam safety program?
dam task force,
Sorry, I
dam
was
task
looking
force?
at, was the.
There have been a couple presentations from the dam safety division
Yeah,
about the applicability of this section.
that,
okay.
in Morrisville's case, FERC didn't say anything to them. They have permits that they have to get through A&R. A&R came in and said, you're breaking the law.
They're probably breaking their water quality for, maybe that's what they're doing. But this, so this would allow the government to waive the water quality permit rules.
Yes, in consultation with the secretary, provided that there has been a determination made by the director of the Division of Emergency Management for a dam owner that has a plan approved by the secretary in place.
So the FERC regulation doesn't really matter if we're talking about the water quality permit. Okay. That makes sense.
This would also affect Princeville.
Yeah. It's good for us.
And now, if we are far enough downstream,
Yeah,
the
good,
tips.
good.
Sections 21 and 22 refund overpayments from two municipalities. You've heard about them and the overpayment amounts. I have them up on the screen now. The overpayments were due to insufficient retention of the tax increment from those municipalities in each municipality for a period of 4 to 5 years. As was discussed, this was found in an auditor's report. Chris mentioned that there is a suggested amendment here, and he is correct that it is quite technical. I won't say nerdy, but maybe it is. So, as Chris mentioned, first, the education
So
fund
we
has
don't
to
have
have,
the, is this the amendment?
this is the amendment.
Aha, you do have the. I have one. Here's some amendments for you, Caroline.
Okay.
Here's some amendments over there. Okay,
So the first step is to make sure that the ed fund has the money for this. So in FY '26, $621,479 is shifted from the general fund to the education fund, transferred, is the appropriate term here, to compensate these two municipalities for the overpayments. Subsection B notwithstands 16 VSA section 4025, which is really interesting because I'm not sure that it has to be expressly notwithstood here. And that is the section that states that if you use ed fund monies for any other purpose, that the entire chapter for education financing is repealed. So that is not withstood. And then $621,479 from the ed fund is appropriated to the Department of Taxes for the two refunds for the TIF overpayments.
so the sections, I'm confused. So the version I'm looking at of the bill is which is the House, as passed by the House. Should I read, and then I have the, that's just a finance amendment. Is that what we're
We
amending?
should be looking at, and I should have worn my glasses so that I could see my computers
21 and
a little
22.
better.
Yeah, but if you look at the House passed bill, there's no section 21.
The amendment is directed towards the report from the Committee on Government Operations. So you should be looking at their recommendation, specifically draft 2.5, which is what they voted out.
Yeah, what we have is the draft 1.1 of the, this is the amendment. So we don't have,
I went to the calendar.
the calendar has it. So on our webpage, the bill as recommended by finance is not here, although it says what it says here, as recommended by the Senate Committee on Finance, is just their amendment,
Correct.
not
The whole.
the whole bill.
Correct. I will make sure that before I leave the seat, I send to the committee a copy of the government operations report, which is up on the big screen now, as well as the finance amendment to that report and your proposed
So
amendment.
debate, but as passed by House, the effective dates, they're section 15. So
So
where did the other sections go?
Senate GovOps has proposed a strike all to the as passed by House
And they
version
added 4 sections?
and removed a few and reorganized a bunch. So
Okay.
I'll note that although there were 15 numerical sections, there were 5 sections, 14A through D.
Oh, okay, so those turned into new sections, okay,
Should be up in a moment.
so that's where we got this, okay,
It's in today's calendar too.
right.
So there are these sections 21 and 22 in the GovOps report. Those are just the 2 TIF sections dealing with Barry and Milton. And bring it back so swiftly. I wish I was more dexterous and skilled. Replacing those 2 sections with this 1 section that does the following. Transfers money from the general fund to the ed fund to cover this cost, appropriates monies from the ed fund to the Department of Taxes, and directs tax to send that money in the appropriate amounts to Milton and Barry.
Which part didn't, in the bill, did not, which parts of that you said were not in the bill?
The parts that were not in the bill were the transfer from the general fund to the ed fund and the appropriation to tax to then issue the payments.
Okay.
And I'll note that get to learn things all the time. The language that appeared in the government operations report was taken from a bill that was introduced not only this biennium, but also the last biennium. And that language came from a whole succession of other acts that have been passed since 2016, all doing the same thing. And it was for purposes of this bill that someone finally flagged, this isn't acceptable practically, but also maybe there are some other legal and other considerations that should be conducted.
Okay. Any other questions about this bill? If not, we can have an amendment or a motion to accept the finance committee's report and then further amend it with this technical correction from Committee of Appropriations.
So moved.
So moved. Maybe we can have our clerk emeritus. That's our current clerk is AOL. Once a clerk, always a clerk. Except, you can't use my, here, I have a good pen.
Senator Norris,
Yes.
Senator Watson,
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator Westman, yes. Senator Burchett.
Yes. Anybody want to be there for this? I'm happy to do it. If not, put it down. Okay, 1 bill down. Thank you.
Jesus, only one.
We almost did. Now we're gonna take up H479, housing bill. We got the triple legislative council listed up there, but we only have 2. Who wants to talk to us about this bill?
Yeah, Michael.
Michael, okay. Good afternoon. Give me a brief moment.
Okay, for the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. We're looking at 479, which was the House, companion housing bill to S-127 that you all passed earlier this session. And having some internet issues, so, okay. While I try to get connected to Zoom, I will just comment that the two housing bills, your S-127, House H-479, there wasn't a lot of direct conflict in those two bills, but there were certain things that you all addressed in the Senate version. For example, you had two sections related to smoke and carbon monoxide alarms that were not in the housing bill. The housing bill that came out of the House had sections related to appeals, for example, that were not in the Senate bill. So what the Senate Economic Development Committee did was essentially work to combine those two things together with a strike all amendment, and that came out of committee there, went to the Senate Natural Committee, and there is a proposal of amendment that came out of that committee to remove certain sections and then to add a report. And so I will try to.
In this version we have definitely has economic development edits. Do we have?
You should have the proposed amendment to that report from Senate Natural as well. I sent it earlier, so you should have two documents. Okay, now that I am.
Oh, yeah, it's under.
I just sent a request to be able to share screen. There we go. Okay, so 5.1 is the underlying proposal of amendment from the Senate Economic Development Committee. And then you should also have this draft 1.1, which is the Committee on Natural Resources proposal to amend that committee report. Mr. Chair, how in-depth would you like to go? Do you want me to just focus on what is different from what you all passed earlier?
Yes, but it's high altitude.
Keep it super high. Okay.
And then any, we'll have, there's a fiscal note, right? So you can just maybe mention sections that have in it, but then we'll focus on those when we do the fiscal note. So yeah, just any highlights,
okay.
Big changes.
Big changes. The first one is going to be in VHIP. So both bills amended the Vermont Rental Housing Improvement Program. The primary difference here is when we get to page 5. And again, this is looking at that draft 5.1. So currently under VHIP, a landlord can receive a grant or a 5-year loan, or they can receive a 10-year loan. And if you all recall the version of this bill you passed 127, it amends the 10-year loans to allow landlords to rent those units for fair market rent, as opposed to requiring those landlords to rent to an individual who fits into one of these populations. So this is where all the strike language is on page 4 right here. So under the 10-year forgivable loans, landlord can rent for fair market rent established by HUD, and it removes the requirement to lease the unit to individual among those population groups. Those requirements apply to the grants in the 5-year program. The Senate bill proposed to strike the 5-year forgivable loan, so it would only allow for grants and 10-year loans. The House version wanted to keep the ability to offer 5-year loans. That's the primary difference. And what the House did was here on page 5, they also added in a minimum set aside that has to be dedicated to grants and 5-year loans. So 30% of the funds annually must be set aside for grants and 5-year loans. The thought process being they want those funds to ultimately flow to support individuals among those populations, homeless, refugee resettlement, etc. So they kept the 5-year option, and they put in a minimum set aside. At least 30% of the funds annually go to that portion of the program.
It's only those 5-year loans and grants that you have that restriction on who you rent it to.
Yes, sir, based on the changes that are in this bill.
Okay.
Yep. So It has some language in here under the subsection 2, where they have to consult with the Agency of Human Services about whether 30% annually is enough, whether it should be higher than that. And then they have to work with, these coordinated entry lead agencies and homeownership centers to try to identify individuals to refer to be able to rent these units. And then lastly, if you look at this new subsection J, which is on page 6, the House wanted some annual reporting requirements that was not in the Senate version as it passed.
Okay.
So providing some program outcomes. That's the primary change in VHIP. The next change that I would highlight is going to be all the way down on page 12. And I'll just mention the sections here. Section 2, you have the Manufactured Home Improvement Repair Program. This is putting this program in statute. This was in the Senate bill, same as what passed in 127. There was no conflict between the House and the Senate version. You get to section 3, Vermont Infrastructure Sustainability Fund. This is beginning on page 9. This was in both bills. There was some minor tweaks that were recommended by the Vermont Bond Bank that the House agreed to and the Senate committee agreed to the exact same changes. And it's primarily going to be at the bottom of this section, page 12, where under the revolving funds, the bond bank requested adding this language in sub 2 on lines 7 and 8. So it's the bank can use the funds in conjunction with other programs that they have. There's not a lot of money going to them. I think in the budget it ended up being $7 million or something to that effect. And the bond bank believes they have that authority, but they wanted the explicit authority to be able to utilize those funds in conjunction with other program funds that they have to maximize their effectiveness. So
there's
really
that they can combine the funds, not that they could use the funds for this program for other programs.
correct.
Makes sense.
And so that's really there were some very minor technical language tweaks in that section, but nothing that was really substantive. To keep you going, section 4 was in S127. This is language that was also in the budget regarding the rental housing revolving loan program and allowing landlords to charge a little bit more in rent increases per year. The next 2 sections start on page 13. They're just 2 study committees. This first one on, actually no, the Senate Economic Development removed one of them. So there's only one, which is the Housing and Residential Services Planning Committee. This was in S127. It did have appropriations. You all removed that and inserted language that, it had per diems.
Right.
You all removed and added language saying that per diems are only available in the event there's an appropriation for that purpose. There wasn't an appropriation, so, and that language is still in here in this committee section.
So anybody that, is there a couple legislators?
Yeah.
There's one from the House, one from the Senate.
So they will not be able to get reduced.
This,
Or the legislative budget would just have to eat it.
the legislative budget would just eat it for those 2 individuals.
Right. Okay.
Okay. On page 17, these next few sections were not in S127, so I'll just walk through them briefly. The first one, these are all about information that's going to the tax department. And I should zoom in there, my apologies. Section 6 this is information that municipalities provide to the tax department for purposes of, the education property grand list. The request from the administration was to add that the municipalities provide them with an extract of the assessor database, also referred to as computer-assisted mass appraisal system. My understanding is this is to help them further develop information about housing availability across the state. And that is also, there's a change in the landlord certificate. So this is information that landlords provide in the tax department in order to be able to provide the renter rebate that they do. And there were changes made to the landlord certificate you all made last year. What this proposal would do is repeal what you did last year and insert new changes, and it's primarily to fix some errors that were made last year and what was done. For example, last year, unfortunately, the school property account number, which was required previously, was struck. And the tax department says that's the best way to identify specific parcels of property, so they need that information, so you're adding that back in. I think that was probably just inadvertent. I was not here though. And then the other key difference to what's in this bill versus what was done last year is last year it would add the requirement to provide on the landlord certificate the gross rental amount that the landlord is charging for the unit. And the tax department said that's not information that they need to actually administer the landlord certificate. There was concern about ensuring compliance with the landlord certificate. The tax department testified they've been able to get, I think it's all the way up to 90+% of the rebates going out, within a certain number of weeks. And they're trying to keep that positive momentum going. So they were requesting to remove certain pieces of information that aren't necessary to administer the program. So that's primarily the difference of what passed last year versus what's in this bill. Okay. There's a report on the next section, the land bank report from the Department of Housing and Community Development. Happy to talk in detail about that if you all would like.
No detail.
There's in the next few sections, housing and public accommodations. There is new language here, section 10, page 21. This is language that was not in 127, but it was worked on in the House, and the committee wanted to incorporate it in because the Senate Economic Development Committee was supportive of it. It requires that a landlord in conducting a background or a credit check, they may request a social security number. If the individual applicant doesn't have a social security number, then they have to accept an individual taxpayer identification number or a government issued ID. That's new to what was in S127. In addition, when you look at the Unfair Housing Practices Act, S127 only included citizenship. So this is adding protections into the Unfair Housing Practices Act. 127 only included citizenship. This proposal would add immigration status into that section. To keep you moving, the next few things, beginning on page 26, the next few sections, 14, 15, 16, and 17 are all related to housing appeals. This is language that was in the House version that the Senate Economic Development Committee is proposing to keep. However, the committee report from Senate Natural Resources Committee is proposing to remove these sections from this. I'm probably not the best person to speak to those sections if you all want detail. You have the chair of that committee with you. Ellen, this would be her area of expertise, and I think we could have her come join if you all wanted to get to that granular level of detail. But just there are sections here.
Chair of the natural can tell us if we want to get into it.
If you want it.
I'm not.
Anticipating that we'll amend the appeals process sometime in the future. This is not that language.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead to section 19, which is on page 34. These next few sections are related to brownfields or development soils, Michael O'Grady's area of expertise. I will just highlight that all of the sections in here are what you passed out in S127 with no changes. There is a piece that I will highlight for you all in section 23, and this is on page 38. This is slightly different than what you all passed in 127 earlier this session. This is money that has been appropriated previously, and there was the Joint Fiscal Office asked that we redraft that section to the language that is here on screen, which corresponds to language that is in the budget. I'll defer to Michael as far as the specifics of the purpose of this section since he is here.
Okay.
So last year, you appropriated 2.5 million to DEC generally for brownfields use. This year, the agency is requesting that money that's been unexpended be transferred to the ECF because it gives them more flexibility in using the money. JFO asked, when you originally proposed, it was transferring from DEC to the ECF 2.5 million. As it turns out, DEC had already used some of the money. And so this is the language that JFO is requesting, that in fiscal year 26, A&R is authorized to disperse up to 2 million from the ECF, and that's what they effectively what they have left from the 2.5 appropriated last year.
Okay, and does it affect the 2 million that we're giving them this for FY '26?
Does not.
Okay.
Okay, section 24 and 25 are related to smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. These are technical amendments that were requested by the Division of Fire Safety to allow for UL 217 compliant smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. This was in S127. It was done as a floor amendment, I believe, so that nothing has changed from what you all passed earlier this session. Which gets us to page 42. This is new language that the State Economic Development Committee requested. This is a positive rental payment pilot program with the State Treasurer's Office. So it allows the State Treasurer, or I should say it requires the State Treasurer to contract with a third party to onboard, I believe it's up to 10 landlords throughout the state, to register up to 100 tenants, to report their positive rental payments to credit reporting agencies for the purposes of trying to build up credit for those individuals. The Treasurer's Office initially requested $100,000 to administer that program. And knowing that that was not in the budget negotiations as they were moving forward, the Senate Economic Development Committee proposed this section 26A, which is the duty to implement that is contingent upon appropriations in FY '26. And then you get to section 27 and 28, tax increment financing, which is kind of the remainder of the bill. This is the project-based CHIP language that you all worked on. There's no changes to what was passed in 127. It was just a copy and inserted over from there. And that's the end of the Senate Economic Development with effective dates, having the repeal of the prospective landlord certificate go into effect upon passage, as well as the rental housing revolving loan fund program language, which was in the budget as well. Those go into effect on passage, passage. The rest of the bill July 1. Then, very quickly, as I mentioned, when you look at the Natural Resources and Energy Committee's recommendation, is to amend that report on economic development by striking out first, as I mentioned, striking out all of those sections related to housing appeals, and then by also inserting this new report requirement regarding surface water discharges.
Okay,
And that's what you have.
thank you for that walkthrough. Any questions for Mr. Wood? Okay. Mr. Duffy, do you want to just give us a quick view of the fiscal note?
Sure. James Duffy, Joint Fiscal Office. I have the fiscal note for H479 pulled up behind me. As this comes to you from Senate Economic Development, there are really, I think, only a couple of sections of the fiscal note that are of interest from an appropriations point of view. Legislative Council has alluded to some of them during Cameron's walkthrough just now. So section 1 pertaining to the Vermont Rental Housing Improvement Program, VHIP, this program authorization is the same language that currently lives in the Senate Housing Bill, which is in the House. So this is the same for the most part between S127 and H479. The one caveat to that is the change that Cameron just walked through with you all about the tenant selection requirements for the 10-year loans, with those tenant selection requirements being removed and replaced with the requirement that instead rent payments, including utilities, not exceed fair market rent. The other change made here from the previous version of this bill is the requirement that the Department of Housing and Community Development establish that minimum 30% allocation of annual VHIP funding for 5-year grants or forgivable loans. Those are the two changes in directives to how DHCD operates with the appropriations given to it annually for VHIP. But apart from those, the program authorization is largely the same as S147. There were no changes made to section 2 pertaining to the manufactured home improvement and repair program from the last version of this language that the committee has seen. What this bill is accomplishing, same as S127, is establishing what has been a not temporarily funded, but a program that's been funded through federal funds in previous years. This program is being established on a more permanent basis in statute as part of DHCD's base funding going forward. Section 3, the Vermont Infrastructure Sustainability Fund. This has also not changed since the last time the committee saw it, with the exception of that one line giving additional flexibility to the Vermont Bond Bank to leverage the appropriation that was given to it for the bond bank with other complementary program funds that they've been authorized to use, just to help leverage this appropriation with other appropriations that can help them do this work. This isn't changing the authorization that was previously given to the Infrastructure Sustainability Fund in previous versions. It just gives the agency additional flexibility to leverage it with other programs.
Can I ask you a question on back to section 1? Is there a definition of fair market value? Fair market rent?
So. That would be a good question for Cameron. So I'm not seeing one in H479, not to say that there isn't an example or a definition somewhere in Vermont statutes, but I'm not seeing one in the bill.
Because it says they have to not exceed fair market rent. So I wonder what fair market rent is different than market rent.
Right. What I can do, Chair, is I can shoot Cameron a note out of the chair. I don't know if other ledge counsel in the room has experience with that, but I can I can coordinate with Cameron and get a question or an answer.
Okay.
Back to you on that.
Yeah.
How that is defined.
Yeah, and who's making the determination? Is the determination fair or market or both?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So section 5 is another kind of appropriations connected one. This is a planning committee that would create a plan for the creation of additional housing units, specifically service supported housing units for Vermonters living with developmental disabilities. As currently drafted, members of this would be eligible for per diems and expense reimbursements. The per diems for non-legislative members are contingent in this language. There is no money for per diems for those members in the FY26 budget. But as I understand it, there is kind of a separate pot of money set aside for reimbursements and per diems for legislative members of study committees, of which this has two. Sections 19 through 23 pertain to brownfields. Cameron mentioned this change during his walkthrough, but essentially what section 23 would do that's new is it would just kind of clean up some technical language that would allow A&R to access these brownfield funds through the environmental contingency fund, as opposed to the direct appropriation that had been made previously to them. This is a preference of the agency that these funds live in the environmental contingency fund. And so this is technical language that reverts that general fund appropriation back to general fund and then transfers it to the ECF for A&R's use. The duty of the state treasurer's office to carry out the requirements of the positive rental payment credit reporting pilot in sections 26 and 26A are contingent on an appropriation for that purpose. There was not an appropriation made for this purpose in FY26, so this is simply an authorization for the treasurer's office, but it's absent an appropriation in FY26. And then that brings us to sections 27.
Who is going to do that reporting? The landlord would do it by?
As currently written, the duty to implement these provisions lives with the state treasurer, and they are directed in the bill to contract with a third-party vendor to carry out various components of the process, recruiting or pilot participants and managing some of the implementation day to day.
Okay.
And then that brings us to sections 27 and 28, which are the CHIP provisions of the bill. So Senate Economic Development had added this language to 479 when they took possession of the bill. I think the most important thing for this committee to understand is this CHIP language is the same CHIP language that was passed out of the Senate originally in S-127. So S-127 has been moving through the House the last several weeks. It's accumulated various recommended changes during its time there. H-479's CHIP language is the CHIP language that was originally passed out of the Senate in S-127. And that brings us through the end of the fiscal note. I will say that I am not the CHIP and TIF expert in our office. I'm happy to take what questions I can answer from the committee if there are any regarding the CHIP provisions. But would also be happy to have Pat Hitterton from our office come in and speak to this more in depth if the committee would like. Then
That's good.
one final note on this bill is that a previous version had authorized another study commission within DHCD for universal residential design. This is a study committee that would explore reforms, initiatives, strategies for creating housing that is accessible to people of different ability limitations, and that was removed from H-479 in Senate Economic Development. That provision does still exist in S-127 over on the House side.
The Senate removed it, even though they passed it in their own bill?
What was that, Senator?
The Senate removed it?
The Senate Economic Development removed the universal design study
Even though they passed
authorization.
their bill with it in? They didn't like their own proposal?
I'm not 100% sure that the residential universal design was originally in S-127. It may have picked that up
In the House.
during its time in the House. And I do think there was also kind of concern about how that committee might interact with other existing work groups in the housing world, in the state. I did just want to note for the committee though, that the $15,000 appropriation for that residential universal design study is in the fiscal year 26 budget. The money was appropriated to the agency to do the work.
So they just won't have the committee to help them with the work, but they'll still do the work?
They'll have the appropriation, and currently S-127 has the authorization for DHCD to do that work. I'm not quite sure which bill might be the vehicle for the various housing provisions moving forward. If it's S-127, their authorization to use that $15,000 does live in S-127 currently. I just wanted to offer that to the committee as one potential consideration, whether you all would like to add that authorization back into the bill, considering there's an appropriation for it that's already been incorporated into the FY26 budget, but that's obviously the committee's discretion. But the money does exist in the FY26 budget for that work.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, Mr. Duffy? Seems things that we already knew about or don't really affect general fund, so I will entertain a motion to pass favorably page 479. Senator Baruch made a motion. Oh, no longer the old clerk.
You're gonna let those two legislators work on.
Well, they don't get money.
Well, they get per diem.
Well, I guess they get per diems from the legislative budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On a point of personal privilege, can I say how pleased I am with our current clerk? Really doing it right.
Yeah, when the former clerk just called the roll, you weren't here.
I never got called.
Sure, I do not want to put Cameron on the spot. I do want to put it that I was going to email Cameron regarding your question about whether H-479 defines fair market.
Well, I did get information. It seems like it's a term of art from HUD. And so that's when you use it, capitalize your return to the HUD fair market. Okay. Thank you. Okay, sorry to interrupt the roll call.
The clerk's quite all right. I haven't started yet.
Oh, okay.
Okay. H-479, Senator Norris.
Yes.
Senator Watson,
Yes.
Senator Baruch,
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator Westman.
Yeah.
Senator Brennan, yes. Senator Perchley.
Yes, with explanation.
How about a reporter?
That was gonna be an explanation that I don't remember.
I'll do it.
A lot of A and R stuff in there.
I'm already reporting it for natural resources, so, yeah.
You don't need.
Because if it's.
Smooth
not-
transition.
There's nothing to say, so.
Okay.
De minimis.
You don't even have to sit down.
Exactly.
What was
We'll
the other
save
term?
time.
Can't really say de minimis. Because there is
There's a lot going on.
Oh, maybe I
somehow.
don't want to do this.
a bit connected.
Marginal,
Yield
is that what
to
it, marginal,
yourself.
marginally de minimis,
Yeah,
or what was
right.
that term?
Marginal,
Marginal,
not marginally de minimis, just marginal impact on.
marginal impact.
I miss McCormick, he used to say de minimis impact on the fisc.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Okay, we're gonna move to one more bill, 231, technical corrections, fish and wildlife. Also, Mr. Duffy, you can, if there's a joint fiscal, there's a fiscal note on this bill.
There is as well,
You
yes,
wanna do a quick walkthrough of the,
absolutely,
what you're sitting there?
happy to. Well, my computer has just decided to reboot, but I can talk to you about the bill while it is
Yeah.
doing so, if the committee would like. So on H 231, there are several, overall, the impact of the bill is de minimis. There are various provisions that would affect permit fee revenue that Department of Fish and Wildlife collects for fishing licenses. So Section 7 of the bill, for example, would authorize the department to issue free lifetime fishing licenses for Vermonters with developmental disabilities. That comes with a cost in the form of foregone fishing license revenue. The revenue impact of that really depends on how many people avail themselves of this new license opportunity in the future, how many years they choose to reauthorize that lifetime license. As I understand, I think there's kind of a check-in every year if you're going to be making use of your lifetime free fishing license with the department.
So it's not really lifetime.
It is, it's just, my understanding of how it works in Vermont with other lifetime licenses that we offer is I believe you you might submit a form to the
Use it or
department.
lose it, kind of?
This is maybe a better question for legislative council.
To put it coarsely, they wanna know if you're alive.
Oh, okay.
They wanna know who's actively using the lifetime licenses on an annual basis.
Helps us with our tax expenditure.
Lifetime,
fair enough.
you gotta know.
And to that end, this portion of the bill would also require the Department of Fish and Wildlife to report back annually to the legislature on the foregone fishing license revenue from across the various categories of free licenses that they issue. And in talking with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, we estimated that the bill would cost, let me pull up this. What's that?
2,800.
Thank you. Annually, an estimate of $2,800 annually, just based off of similar provisions that exist in other states that offer similar free licenses. The next section of the bill also, with visible impact, also pertains to fishing licenses. So there is a component of the bill whose number I will have for you momentarily. Section 9 of the bill would change the way the department assesses fishing tournament permit fees. So right now there's a flat $50 fee for the assessment of fishing tournament permits. This would change that fee to a tiered $30 or $100 permit fee based on how many people you expect to participate in your tournament.
This is gonna affect the walleye or the
Tournament?
LCI.
And then you have a lot of ice fishing tournaments too, so.
How many tournaments are there?
They're all over the place,
Oh,
but
a
there's,
lot.
Like how many?
Some are,
12? Or-
Yes, but the walleye one was the one we
no,
spent.
there's, I don't know,
25 on
I could put, probably 25, 30. Small ones, large
fire
ones,
departments
you
put
know.
them on,
Yeah.
everybody puts them on.
And so if you're having a tournament with less than 50 participants, you're actually paying less for this permit than you were before, because before it was $50, now it will be 10 or 30. The amount will go up for larger tournaments of 50 participants or more to $100. So that represents, on net possibly less fee revenue coming to the Department of Fish and Wildlife from those fees. But at the same time, currently, if you want to have a permit on the first Saturday of June and the first Saturday of July and the first Saturday of August, you can do all that under one fishing tournament permit. Now, that would be kind of, if you consider a loophole, that loophole would be closed. So if you're gonna have a tournament under one permit, they all have to happen on consecutive days. So all in all, the department sees this as a de minimis fiscal impact, with little expected change to fishing tournament permit fee revenue. Sections 10 through.
Senator Norris says,
This is probably a question from Mike Swalwell. I was just gonna ask on the $10 for 25. So is this all pre-registered, or just after you count heads at the tournament, you know which one to apply for, or for the permit?
So you apply up front, but they ask you to estimate how many people are going to participate, and that's how you're going to pay the fee.
Someone tell them 25, pay $10, but if there's more than that, then what's gonna happen?
Tournament police will, intervene.
They might require an adjustment, or warden might, ask for an adjustment, but
Okay, thanks.
most of them are gonna be in the medium and large categories.
that's fine. Why have a tournament if you're only got less than 20?
It's cost, I was looking at.
It's fun.
Yeah.
It's like a family tournament.
So that's fishing tournament permit fees. Overall, the minimus expected impact. And Michael will talk more about the various changes that are being made to fish and wildlife enforcement provisions. The bill would increase the maximum penalty associated with certain violations, and it would also reclassify certain violations, fish and wildlife violations, as minor violations, which would move their jurisdiction over to the Judicial Bureau, where they're treated more as civil offenses than as criminal offenses, as many of them currently are. In talking with the department about this, they are not anticipating this to change, dramatically the revenue that they receive every year from the assessment of these penalties. A lot of it depends on judicial discretion and what the amount of the penalty is. JFO doesn't forecast fines and penalties, but overall, small fiscal impact anticipated to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, just based on the changes and the number of violations that occur each year versus, what their annual budget is each year as well. So it represents a small portion of their overall revenue. And then finally, section 19 of the bill would repeal an existing program run through the Department of Fish and Wildlife, through which farmers can claim reimbursement for certain crop damage caused by a deer or bear.
Oh, my gosh,
Yeah.
we're repealing it. I
Yeah.
remember when we wrote it.
And, so currently, eligible farmers can submit claims to the Department of Fish and Wildlife for up to $5,000 annually, provided that their land isn't posted against the hunting of deer or bear. That's one of the eligibility requirements for receiving reimbursement.
They
through this
received a
program.
big bill last year.
That's right. In the past, and you'll see that in the fiscal note, the last paragraph here says, from fiscal year 22 through 24, a total of 4 reimbursement requests were dispersed by the department, totaling $207,000. However, the vast majority of that sum came from one rather large claim, which I believe was, $200,000.
Yeah.
That was submitted before this $5,000 annual cap was
Right.
put in place. A special appropriation had to be made in the budget for that year to cover the department's cost of paying out that claim. Now there's a $5,000 annual cap. When you exclude that large payment that wouldn't be allowable under current caps, this is something the department spends an average of about $4,400 on per year. And again, there have been 4 farmer claims between FY 22 and 24.
Okay.
And that's the extent of the disclosure.
Like 4 diminishes
That's correct.
equal of non-diminishes?
Automatic. 3/4 with 4 de
You're gonna have to
minimis.
say that 4 times? Or?
Okay. Any questions, Mr. Duffy, on the fiscal note? Is there anything you want to tell us about the rest of the bill, Mr. Grady or Grady?
Do you want to know about this?
I got one question on the rest of the bill.
Okay.
And it was referring to, and Senator Watson had this conversation, the air rifles, air guns, whatever you want to call them, they have thrown them into the category of what, and what's the violation going to be, and
You can join us up here if you want. over here.
Do you have the air gun?
I don't.
I'm just checking.
No.
I used to. Back when I was mad.
This is
Telegun?
Mike O'Grady with Legislative Council in response to Senator Norris' question. There's currently a provision in law, it's effectively an anti-jacking provision, that prohibits a person from carrying their rifle or shotgun in a loaded manner. But as weapons have evolved over the past few years, there are weapons that deer jackers are using that are not rifles or shotguns. They are basically pneumatic or air canister guns. I would recommend that you check out sites like Kentucky Ballistics or a few others to show you the power of these guns, these weapons. For instance, a arrow rifle can shoot an arrow through the doors of a car. They are very effective for those who want to take deer out of season at night, etc., because they are quiet and effective.
Is it a ballistic or is it always an arrow?
Pardon?
Or do they fire ballistic or is it always an arrow kind of thing?
There are pellets. There are two different, the air rifle that you might think you possessed once upon a time has a canister that screws onto it and can have the power of 22 or more. The pneumatic rifle has kind of an outside, it's really kind of it has a exterior way of firing, but it can really be just a canister as well. They can be very, they're just as effective as rifles.
So I guess my question is, am I getting back to, I've done some reading on them, I'm sure they're effective or whatever else, that's not my concern. My concern is that they don't really meet the definition of a firearm and or a rifle. So and I don't oppose this, my question is, what is Fish and Wildlife going to charge them if the definition of rifle or firearm doesn't quite meet? I mean, the closest they come is...
They define what they are in the bill. You can see, what page is it?
We're looking at the page of the size.
So the violation would be possession of a air rifle while loaded in
your motor.
They're not going to call it a rifle or a firearm.
No,
and then moves or rifling or just...
In the House, there was language that was confusing interested parties because it could have been interpreted to mean a handgun. And a handgun can be lawfully carried in a motor vehicle while loaded. So the language was removed. Fish and Wildlife went off to work on it. They came back with these definitions of the specific weapons they're looking to regulate. They added in the term or other projectile, because the arrow rifles, for instance, don't use a cartridge. You load the specific rifle, the specific arrow for the rifle into the rifle. So it's not a cartridge.
Charged.
No, it's not even
there's no combustible material with it, I mean.
No, that's the thing, that's why it's distinct from a firearm, because it's not, the projectile is not being expelled through the use of combustion. And if you really want to see what they look like and how they work, there are definitely people out there on YouTube that will, it's pretty amazing.
And did Senate Natural Resources, did you make an amendment from the House passed bill?
Yes, so
So I'm just looking at the passed by house.
Yeah, as passed by the House is a much smaller bill. This is actually a combination of a couple of bills. This is the original 231 plus 230, which has some other provisions that don't, I would say, necessarily pertain to appropriations, but is about the taking of amphibians and reptiles, as well as missing some stuff here. But there's some other things in here. But it's worth mentioning too, this part about the air rifles had not been worked out in 231 by the time it came to us, and they said, could you try to figure this out? And we did. So there you go. Oh, you're watching.
Is that Rifleman? You're watching Rifleman?
Yeah, no, this is Kentucky ballistics.
Can you share that on screen?
Oh dear.
I think we got that. Any other things you want to point out, Mr. Brady or the chair? Then
With regard to the appropriations, no, I don't think there's really anything that James hasn't addressed. I do, one of the things with regard to the bear and deer damage reimbursement, the department kind of philosophically has always opposed it. They didn't think it should be coming out of their budget because it comes directly out of the Fish and Wildlife Trust Fund and takes license revenue away from the department. And then they have to find that funding elsewhere. And so they have never liked that provision, and they're.
Don't think I want to get hit by that.
okay, that makes sense.
What is it, potato launcher?
This is your fault.
Yeah.
That's
Some of our ears are easily distracted.
I'll
Okay.
never get them back.
What are they shooting? What are they? Watermelon?
That's their eargun, that thing.
What's the target? The weird parts. Okay. Yeah,
No.
so Grady's fault. So if there's no questions for Grady, different websites that he recommends, then we will move on. But my understanding that there's a proposed amendment. Is that true?
Yes. I don't know if we have copies of.
We don't have copies, we came through too late, but we have it up on the.
Okay. Yeah, so there is a proposed amendment about including some language in this bill about the climate superfund. As you recall, the treasurer needed some additional money, but so this, it really does three things, and it's all not controversial, thankfully. So one is it changes a report that ANR needs to do from a rulemaking into a report about the climate superfund, and then there's a date pushback for the treasurer for a report that they need to do, and then the third thing is it modifies one of the definitions of covered period to make it match New York.
Okay.
And
So it's up there. So there's how many instances of amendment are there?
maybe I should look. Mr. Grady.
There are 4 sections being added. The first section, section 20, is there's something called the Resilience Implementation Strategy, which the agency had been working on prior to the Climate Superfund Act last year, but you incorporated the Resilience Implementation Strategy as part of Climate Superfund. But the agency's almost done with it, and they don't want to have to go through rulemaking and incur that expense. They've already gone through a public participation process, and they propose to submit it to you as a report rather than going through rulemaking, and that's what section 20 would do. I'm not sure who's driving.
I am, I can move it down.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm doing a lot.
Okay. So, moving down to section 21. Yeah, these are all, that's just moving this resilience strategy out of a rulemaking into what the report is going to include. Moving down further, you get to section 21, which is in part a conforming amendment, because last year in the Climate Superfund Act, you told A&R how and when to adopt the resilience strategy by rule. But if you're not adopting it by rule anymore, you don't need to tell them when they need to initiate and when they need to adopt. The second part of this is that the agency asked for an additional year to adopt the administrative, the kind of technical rules for the program, how you apply, what you provide in your application, how you have process if you receive a cost recovery demand, et cetera. They're asking for an additional year to issue those kind of technical administrative rules. Section 22 is, as Senator Watson noted, the definition of covered greenhouse gases. Could you go back up a little bit, please? Right there. And it's switching the reference or the context for what is going to be measured from the greenhouse gases from those that are released into the atmosphere to the fossil fuels extracted or refined by an entity during the covered period. This will be easier to determine, and it is consistent with the New York Climate Superfund Act, which, as you probably all know, both of those, both Vermont and New York, have been subject to litigation by both private entities and US DOJ. Section going down, subdivision 22, that's just a conforming amendment now that you define covered greenhouse gases with relation to the covered period. You don't need to include the term covered period. Okay. Same change is in section 23. This is the cost recovery demand that the A&R would be issuing to a responsible party. And again, it's a conforming amendment based on the change you made to the definition of covered greenhouse gas emissions. Then you get to section 24. This is the state treasurer's report. The treasurer is going to come back. If you scroll down a little bit more to the next page, you'll see that they will be providing you an assessment of the cost to the state of Vermont and its residents of covered greenhouse gas emissions. Again, striking the reference to the covered period that's been built into the definition, and going back up, extending the deadline date for that assessment from 2026 to 2027. Moving down, there's the effective dates for all of H231 Climate Superfund takes effect on passage. The rest are effective at July 1, 2025, except the free fishing license for persons with developmental disabilities in January 1, because the department likes to set their licenses on a kind of a yearly basis. They already have the book out for the summer about licenses and costs and all that.
So on a calendar year.
Right. And then in section 13, related to the taking of reptiles with amphibians, which you haven't looked at, there is a prohibition on taking reptiles and amphibians intentionally, because currently, if you have a valid hunting license, you can kill as many reptiles as amphibians, turtles, etc., as you want, regardless.
If you have a hunting license.
If you have a hunting license.
Why would that
Any hunting license?
Pardon?
Any hunting license?
Any hunting.
Let's not get into that.
Vermont hunting.
Right.
Well,
So you could have a bear or a moose.
Well, yes, to get the bear license, you need the general hunting.
This isn't the place where they tried to put the thing to, I gotta get a license to kill a frog.
Oh, there's
No,
like,
Same thing.
That's an amphibian.
So that is why the effective date is January 1, 2027. Before that date, the commissioner is going to adopt rules where certain taking, certain killing is allowed. And the prohibition is only on the intentional killing. So if you run over a frog with your lawnmower,
What if you steer toward it?
we talked about it. We talked about it.
There was discussion, the department has concern about proving intent for taking of animals. But they have prosecuted against people who have run over deer with their car, where they follow the deer into a cornfield and run it over with their car in the cornfield.
Car too.
Must have been an old car.
And so
No, it's probably a big truck with a big grill.
Probably not their cornfield.
and their concern was like, how do I prove intent? Well, the response to that is if you shoot 100 turtles,
Yeah.
and if you're leaving water with 100 turtles with rifle holes in them, you intentionally took those turtles. And so.
But frogs?
Again, there is going to be a rule that will allow the taking of what are called, I won't use the term, they're abundant species, common and abundant species. So that's what the commissioner will allow: green frogs, bullfrogs. Most likely, I can't speak for the commissioner, but most likely will be allowed to be taken with your hunting license, because that's how you are allowed to take them today.
So there's gonna be a season.
There may be a
Small game season on frogs.
On frogs?
Well,
Wonder how much that license is gonna cost.
Wrong.
Might bring in
To be
new
fair.
revenue though.
Honestly, it will probably just be an endorsement on your hunting.
It's like a motorcycle endorsement. I do have a question on the climate superfund thing here. Why are we eliminating, or why are we nixing the open period or whatever is referred to here,
So in the definition of greenhouse gases, you refer to the covered period. Covered period is actually a defined term in the bill. In the climate, it's in statute already, but it's just a term of art that's a defined term. So when you refer to it in the definition of covered greenhouse gases during the covered period, you don't have to say during the covered period multiple times. It's already been, the concept's already been incorporated into the definition.
Any other questions on this?
no, we've been hopping all over the place, Ross.
Yeah.
Can't stop them.
Okay, so
There is a Scrivener's error in 231. I forgot to redesignate a subdivision. I'm gonna talk to the Senate Secretary about that.
okay, so controversial, but we'll let you and the Senate Secretary figure that one out. So with that, we entertain a motion for 231 with the amendment. Are people fine with adding the technical corrections from Senator Watson?
Can we split them?
What do you mean?
Vote on one, then vote on the other one? Split them?
You
Have
can
two
always
amendments?
divide the question.
Divide the question. Yeah, there you go.
You want to divide the question
I
into
do.
two amendments?
I want to vote on 231.
Okay.
And then the amendment.
They're gonna vote together though.
Well,
amendment
sure.
Yeah, just, yeah.
Yeah, we could vote on the amendment and then we can vote on 231.
Okay.
Can we do the amendment first?
Whatever.
Do you need two ROAs for that?
We don't need to record the vote on an amendment. So we can,
Straw poll.
but we could straw poll, we could ask the clerk to write it down for prosperity.
Maybe straw poll, just to make it easier.
Okay, so on Senator Watson's amendment, by show of hands, who votes for that amendment? Okay. 4 votes, who votes against that amendment?
One of.
You can not vote, is that allowed?
I
He
doesn't
doesn't like frog.
I thought the
I
rules.
don't like the frog
No.
piece.
Can't really.
Then you can vote against the
You
whole
gotta-
bill.
you gotta
Yeah,
yes, no.
abstaining is
I don't
not-
like the frog piece.
Well, we're
You
voting
could
on
take a
the,
frog.
We're voting on
voting
the,
on the,
This is on the amendment.
It's a super fun here.
Okay, we'll count it as a yes.
4-2 and a question mark.
4-2-1.
Well, you can't not vote if you're here. You'd have to take a walk and pretend that you're not here.
I just did. You didn't see
So
me.
fast.
Okay, well, passes, so that's now part of the bill. And so now 231 as amended by Senate Appropriations.
231 as amended by Senate Appropriations. I'll put the reporter down already because it has de minimis in it 4 times, so that's you.
I'm neat
Senator-
and de minimis.
Senator Norris,
Yes.
Senator Watson.
Yes.
Senator Baruch.
Yes.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator Westman.
No.
Senator Brennan. Yes, Senator Perchlik.
Yeah. And I don't kill frogs.
On purpose.
We've
I
all
love
done it.
frogs, and you can't kill rattlesnakes.
He's got a lot of
because
froggers
they're
up in his
protected.
district, so he's
Or fox turtle.
looking
We're
out.
live, but
There's
I'm
always
not gonna
one
respond to
But
that.
I don't like them.
My brother's friend, Mike,
Reporter?
she's selling front.
All right. Mr. De Minimis.
Gonna be a tough one. What I do for the team though.
Yeah.
New sheriff in town.
Yep. An old new sheriff.
Okay, any other business committee members want to bring before the committee?
By the way, no.
Okay, so we can